Okay. Next try. So, welcome everybody to our first talk in our series of ELLIS Distinguished Lecture Talks. It's my great pleasure to welcome Hinrich Schütze from the LMU in Munich, not München, or the same. Before he begins his talk, let me briefly introduce Hinrich. He has finished his PhD in Stanford in 1995, and then he basically stayed around in that Bay Area for about 10 years before he moved actually to the University of Stuttgart, where he became a full professor, and he stayed in Stuttgart for another 8 years before he unfortunately left us to go to Munich, where he's still at. He received, for example, in 2018, an ERC Advanced grant, and he became an ELLIS Fellow last year, and he has been the president of the Association for Computational Linguistics since 2020. Before I go into further details, I just want to hand over to Hinrich now, and thank you very much, Hinrich, for giving this first talk of this year's winter semester lecture series.
Thank you very much, Ingo, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a great honor to be invited to speak here. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. The title is Natural Language Understanding for Task Descriptions and Beyond. And this is joint work with PhD students Nora, Kassner, Kerem, Senel, and Timo, Schick. So first, I want to talk about a little bit, just a few minutes about how humans learn. Then I'm going to take the lessons from that and apply it to a method that we came up with, which is called PET, which imitates some of that human learning. Then I'm going to talk about a new NLU benchmark that we have published. Then the next topic is neurosymbolic methods. A belief bank is a neurosymbolic method for natural language understanding. And then the next part, which is somewhat speculative, but hopefully interesting for you, will be what's next in natural language understanding. How can we make progress? Because part of the gist of my talk is going to be that we're still very far from full natural language understanding. So the common theme of this talk, it's a little heterogeneous, but the common theme is natural language understanding. How do humans do natural language understanding? How do they learn it? How can we leverage the natural language understanding that pre-trained language models have for learning? So this is instruction-based learning. How can we measure natural language understanding? Neurosymbolic models as a new way of doing natural language understanding better, and then what's the future of natural language understanding? So I want to start with a pomegranate, and as a typical example of human learning, how to open and eat a pomegranate. And so we're going to watch, hopefully this is going to work. 1 second. A YouTube video, just about 40 seconds of it. You may have to watch an ad first. Okay, hopefully you can all see the video. And I'm going to turn on captions because making the audio work is a little difficult. So just read the captions. And I want you to pay attention to 2 things. One, the instructor here explains the task and explains the solutions. So pay attention to that, how the instructor does that. And secondly, how many training examples occur in this part of the video that I'm going to show. Okay, read the captions, pay attention to the instructions, how many training instances occur. Okay, we're not going to watch the rest here. Let me close that. Okay, so what did we see in this video? The teacher gives a detailed description of the task and of the solution. The task description is we want a way of opening, eating a pomegranate that is not a pain in the butt and not messy. And the solution description is score the pomegranate along the ridges. At least that's part of it. I mean, the video goes on. And for this particular part of the solution, score the pomegranate along the ridges, there are very few training instances, just three. Three of the ridges are scored if you counted it. So I would argue that this is a typical form of human learning. Humans very often in learning exploit detailed descriptions for learning, and there are very few training instances. Now, of course, there's also human learning that's different. There's human learning where you have lots of training instances, and there are things that you learn by yourself without any instructions. But I think most of you will agree that this is fairly typical of human learning. Compare that with our typical machine learning setup, definitely before 2020, but I think it's still true that in general, we don't have descriptions, we have large training sets, and even if people do fewshot learning, very often there are thousands of examples. I mean, that's beginning to change, but there's very little fewshot learning that uses 3 examples. So the motivation for our approach is that humans take advantage of task descriptions. Machine learning models generally don't, or at least they didn't until recently. How can we incorporate task descriptions into NLP? And that leads to the PET method that we introduced. This is work by Timo Schick, who is now at Meta. And so I'm going to explain the basic idea of PET in a few slides, and then show you some new results we published a few months ago. So I'm going to explain it for a particular task, for the task of sentiment analysis. What we provide for this task is a pattern and a verbalizer. The pattern is kind of a natural language template that induces a pre-trained language model to understand the task. You will see an example on the next slide. And the verbalizer tells the pre-trained language model which words to substitute for a mask position in the pattern and how they map to the labels of the task. We then fine-tune a pre-trained language model on this pattern verbalizer combination. And what we've shown is, and I'll give you the numbers in a few slides, that this gives us excellent fewshot performance, better than GPT-3. Now, we published this first almost 3 years ago, but what I'm going to focus on here is an update, some more recent results we have achieved on this paradigm. So here you see the patterns and the verbalizers, again, for the task of sentiment analysis. What we're going to do is here do sentiment analysis for movie reviews. So this is here a movie review. I really enjoyed this movie. And so the task is to classify the sentence as positive or negative for the movie. And so an example pattern is here. I really enjoyed this movie. It was mask. So the patterns are structured so that you put the input sentence at some position in the pattern, and then you have a mask surrounded potentially by some natural language context, usually surrounded by some natural language context, and then the masked language model is going to put one of the verbalizers into that position. So in this case, I really enjoyed this movie. It was masked. You can imagine that a pre-trained language model has encountered in its training text contexts like that, and therefore it will be pretty good at substituting the correct word here. And I will show that this is true in the next slide, or on the next slides. So what we initially did is we compared this approach to GPT-3, and as you know, GPT-3 is a quite big model. Now there are larger models, but I think the argument and the high-level result is still true here, that iPad is a very parameter efficient model. So GPT-3 has 175 billion parameters and our model 223 million. So that is 0.1% of GPT-3. So we really have a competition here between David and Goliath. And this shows you the comparison in performance between PET and GPT-3. On Superglue, we have 32 training examples. And I'm just going to look at the average here. Here you see the performance of GPT-3, 73, and here is PET and iPad. iPad is an iterative version of PET that uses some unlabeled data. And you can see that PET and iPad are actually better than GPT-3. So I think that's quite amazing that a model that's tiny compared to GPT-3 in the same conditions with the same training data can achieve the same performance. And the reason is the fine-tuning step. We use some supervised learning. So the idea is that to exploit the training set, even if it's a few-shot training set, even if it's just 32 training examples, to fully kind of extract all the information that that training set provides. Supervised training is just the best way of doing it. GPT-3 doesn't do supervised training. It does in context learning, which means it doesn't change any parameters. And we take this result here to mean that that's not the best approach to get good performance on few-shot learning. Here are some more recent results on this PET framework. I'm just going to read the questions and then we're going to go through them in the following slides. Does this actually work in the real world? When this work first came out, there was some doubt about that. I'm going to explain why and how we were able to answer this question. How much does performance depend on the natural language patterns? Can synthetic data boost performance? Can we use a mix of bad and good natural language patterns? And do we need a def set? So if you have a large def set, then the situation completely changes. And so one of the problems in this sub-area of NLP has been that people were not clear about how much of a def set they used and whether they used one at all. So I'm going to talk about that question. First, the performance of different patterns. So for 3 different benchmarks, you see here the performance of different patterns, different natural language patterns. And you see that the performance varies a lot. You have some really well-performing patterns, you have some really badly performing patterns. So there's a huge difference in the performance between different patterns. And this, in our opinion, argues for careful human pattern design. And that is something that's not very popular in machine learning because people want to eliminate any manual work. But we believe that this is actually a good thing because you need some inductive bias, we think, in a few-shot setting because you have very little information to go by. And so that additional information has to come from somewhere. And I think the inductive bias that comes through the human-designed patterns is a really good way of providing additional information to the learning system. The second question we addressed is, can we use a mix of good and bad patterns? So if you don't have a development set, then it's actually very difficult to tell whether a pattern you just designed is good or bad. It may look good to you, but it's hard to predict what a pre-trained language model is going to do with it. So the approach we settled on is we're just going to design a bunch of patterns and then hope that some of them are good. Some of them will also be bad, but as long as our model is robust to a mix of bad and good patterns, that's fine. And what this graph here shows is that as you start with three manually written patterns, that's here on the left edge, as you add random patterns, the performance does degrade, but gradually. This indicates that the method is robust to a mix of good and bad patterns. So if the human designer does a good job at designing patterns, and some of the patterns are good, then this indicates that PET will do well on this. Another important question so a criticism of the original work was that we need unlabeled data. And in many problems, in many few-shot learning problems, you have unlabeled data available, but of course not in all. So what do you do if you don't have unlabeled data? And GPT-3 does not use unlabeled data. So in that sense, the comparison I just showed is unfair for iPad, although it's not unfair for PET. And PET also beat GPT-3 by 1 percentage point in that comparison. So what do you do if you don't have unlabeled data? And here what we tried out was to generate unlabeled data synthetically. I think that's a very nice trick that actually is becoming more common now. I think Timo was one of the first who did this on a large scale. So what we do is we simply generate it using a language model, in this case GPT-2XL. So we have a context like this, example 1, colon, we put the first example from our training set here, of course without the label, and then the second one here, and then we prompt the language model for generating a new input example. And we generate 10,000 examples that way. Here you can see the performance, and I'm only going to focus on, let's see, right. This is with natural data, iPad, and this is iPad with synthetic data. So iPad needs some unlabeled data. So the comparison you have here is iPad with natural unlabeled data versus iPad with synthetic unlabeled data. So that's the comparison here, 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 and so on. And you can see that in some cases, the synthetic data are actually better. Here, for example, for Yelp Full. In some cases, they're worse. For example, here we have a 3-point decline for Yahoo questions and n equals 10. But in general, there doesn't seem to be a big difference in performance. So that's very good. That means if we are in a few-shot situation where we don't have natural unlabeled data, we can generate them synthetically. And so the last investigation was Raft. And this is specifically about the question, do you need a def set or not? I mean, this is partly a methodological problem, because if you want to publish a clean study on basically any problem, you need some type of development data or held out data to investigate variance and the stability of your results. But this is not what we're addressing here. Here we're addressing the question, is it possible to apply this method, PET, if you don't have a development set? Because in true few-shot learning, you don't have a development set. If you have 10 training examples, if you had a large enough development set to do, let's say, hyperparameter tuning, then you wouldn't be in that few-shot setting anymore. And that is actually something that in practice is quite frequent. And as I argued in the beginning, is also a very typical situation for humans. So I think this is an important problem that we should look at. And thankfully, there is actually a benchmark that models this situation very well, and that is Raft. Consists of 11 tasks, each of which has 50 labeled training examples, and it doesn't have a def set. So this is a good model of the real world because we don't have a def set. And here's the performance on Raft by PET. And at the time of publication, this here was the leaderboard leader SetFit with a performance of 66.9 on average, and you can see that PET beats this performance with 69.6. So this we take as proof that this actually does work in a real-world fewshot setting where you don't have a development set. Okay, so that's the update on PET. My implicit assumption for this first part of the talk was this: language models understand language. Because if you remember how the language works, is we have a particular natural language pattern which should resemble what the language model knows from its training set, and the assumption is the language model has developed some kind of understanding of this pattern, and therefore it can solve a task even actually without having trained on it. I didn't show you those results, but even zero shot, based on its natural language understanding, the language model is able to solve this task. And of course, the implicit assumption here is that the language model really has understood language to some extent. So the rest of the talk is really about this question and how far we have come in building two natural language understanding systems. And relevant here is that some authors have actually claimed that there is no real understanding of prompts or instructions in these types of learning mechanisms. This was here the first paper along these lines by Webster and Pavlik. So the topic of the rest of the talk is, do pre-trained language models really understand language? And if not, what do we need to do to get there? And the first thing we need to be able to measure natural language understanding. And so that's why we developed the benchmark for what I would call true natural language understanding. So let me first introduce that benchmark. This is work by Kerem Senel. So the motivation is for this new benchmark, which is called CODA 21, that we have near human performance on many existing NLU tasks, for example, on NLI. And that could look like a good thing, that we have near human performance, but in reality, what that means is that these tasks are too easy, that with you can basically cheat as a language model and do well on these tasks. They don't really measure true natural language understanding. There are other NLU tasks that are harder and that where there is still a big gap between human performance and machine performance, but they often cover a narrow spectrum. For example, a lot of them are school exams, and that's a very important research area, but it's kind of limited, and the question is whether that is typical natural language understanding or not. For CODA 21, there is a big gap between human performance and performance of current models. So it is a difficult benchmark to do well on. And CODA 21 targets core natural language understanding, as opposed to specialized domains like biology and physics in school exams. So here's the task. It's very simple. Given a definition and a context, each for K words, but not the words themselves, the task is to align the K definitions with the K contexts. So in this example here, you have 4 contexts, you have 4 definitions, and your task is to align the context and the definitions. And the words are not given. So this is the context of a particular word here. Let's take this one. But the word is masked. This is the definition of a word, but the word is not given. And the reason we do that is because this is not about having learned the meaning of a word from a corpus. That may also be an interesting task, but that's a separate ball game. What we instead want to test is whether the system has a deep understanding of the context and of the definition, and based on that deep understanding can correctly match the context and the definition. So here, for example, we have his horse kicking up clouds of XXX. And here we have fine powdery materials such as dry earth or pollen. So the language model is supposed to, or in general, our natural language understanding model is supposed to be able to induce that this type of definition here is a good fit for a word that can be used in this context. Or here we have these bees love a fine-grained XXX that is moist. And here we have the definition humus and disintegrated rock. And again, the natural language understanding system is supposed to deduce that a word with this definition can be used correctly and sensibly in this context. And of course, the word here is not of course, but you may have guessed that the word here is dust and the word here is soil. But as I said, the word never appears anywhere in the input because it's not about knowing the word, the meaning of dust and the meaning of soil. That would make the task much easier. It's really about understanding natural language, understanding definitions and contexts. And we take being able to understand definitions of context as a good proxy for general natural language understanding. How can you try to solve this task with a neural approach? We simply use compute log definition given context. So we ask the language model to compute the probability given the context of the definition. And that gives us a score for a particular context definition match. Then we choose the alignment of contexts and definitions that maximizes the sum of the match scores. So if we have k definitions at context, then there are k factorial possible alignments, and we just do an exhaustive search and compute the sum of the match scores for all of them, and then we pick the best alignment. This here is the alignment that a neural approach comes up with, and it's incorrect. It has aligned this context here, the bees love a fine-grained XXS, with this definition here, fine boundary materials such as dry earth or pollen. And it has aligned these two. Now, this is actually there's I omitted something important here, which is that is moist. And so for a human, at least if you spend a minute to think about this, then this is not compatible because something that is dry is not moist. But the language model makes this match, presumably because pollen and bees are not semantically similar, but they are related, they are associated in contexts. And therefore it says, well, bees, pollen sounds like a good match to me. So here are the results of various language models and other baselines on Coda 21. This is here the human performance, 0.86. And the best model is this one here, MPNet with 0.51. So as I said, you can see there's a huge gap between the human performance and the best neural model. Interestingly, MPNet is basically sentence transformers, the UKP Darmstadt sentence similarity package. So basically the task here is reduced to a similarity operation. We compute a vector for this context, We compute a vector for the definition, and we find the alignment that maximizes the similarity scores comparing contexts and definitions. So arguably, this is not really natural language understanding. It's just similarity. I'm going to come back to the question of how much similarity can mimic true natural language understanding. Here are one possible question here is, well, maybe you just need a larger model, because that's often something that's said by people who are really optimistic about deep learning. Yeah, these models, there's some things they can't do, but if we just make the training corpora 10 times larger and the models 10 times larger or 100 times larger, then they will do much better on the task, which has been true for a while. So it's a very legitimate argument. But you can see that in the big bench, so we contributed this Coda 21 benchmark to big bench, and in big bench they also used quite large models, although I guess this is already several months old, and now the models are even larger. And you can see that we are not really approaching human performance here. It's 0.475, so it's very far from human performance, which was close to 90%. Now, so if a neural approach isn't working, and if for a moment we are pessimistic about neural approaches in their current form being able to solve it, what is an alternative? An alternative is certainly a symbolic approach. And symbolic approaches are not so popular right now, but I mean, there's lots of problems, I believe, that a symbolic approach is just the right approach for. So we shouldn't just dismiss them. We should ask the question, can we use a symbolic approach here? So for a symbolic approach, you would need some rules and some facts that you could apply to this alignment problem. And so one fact that might be helpful would be to say a cloud consists of dry material, because then you would be able to say this must match because this is dry and this is a cloud. So if a cloud consists of dry material, then this must be a match. But of course, that's not true, because clouds, for example, in the sky do not consist of dry material. Another attempt would be to say bees do not love pollen. And then you would know this here must be wrong, because this claims that bees love this stuff and this stuff can be pollen. But that's not true either. I'm actually not sure what exactly the relationship between bees and pollen is in terms of loving it or hating it. I think it's neutral, because bees are not particularly interested in pollen. I think they're interested in nectar, and as a side product, they also carry pollen around. But in any case, bees do not love pollen does not seem to be correct. Or maybe another candidate for a fact, for a symbolic fact or rule that you could use here is you cannot kick up clouds of humus and disintegrated rock. And then you would know that this here is not the correct match, because a cloud of humus and disintegrated rock is implausible. But that's the problem. It's implausible, but it is possible. You can easily imagine a situation in which a cloud of disintegrated rock would be produced. So symbolic rules that are about what's possible and not possible don't seem to be the solution for this problem. I'm going over something that I think is probably familiar to everybody, but I just want to remind you of this because it's important, I think, to be aware of that in this context. So we've looked at the neural approach, and that seems to reduce to similarity. That doesn't seem to be the right approach if it really does reduce to similarity, which we can discuss. The symbolic approach I've just argued is not the right approach. So that's why I think neurosymbolic approaches are interesting. And now I want to report on some research we have done recently on neurosymbolic approaches. And it's really about taking the neural network architectures, which are amazing at computing similarity, and similarity is very important for natural language understanding, for making sense of the world, for classification, and in general as kind of a basic engine of intelligence, I believe. But one of the main points I want to make is it's not enough. We also need other things. And so belief bank is a good example, I think, for the type of model that has the similarity-based engine at its core, but it has a layer that is more than that. This is work by Nora Kassner. So belief bank is a neurosymbolic approach. The motivation is that neural models can have contradictory beliefs. So, for example, it can believe that a swallow is a bird, but it can also believe that a swallow is a fish. And you can show that through prompting or other techniques. The main idea of belief bank is that we introduce a kind of symbolic executive who manages, stores, and, if necessary, alters the output of the neural model. And I'm calling it a symbolic executive because I'm trying to draw an analogy to our frontal lobe, the executive function in our brain, which has a similar function. Very roughly, it kind of looks at everything that comes out of the rest of the brain, and if there are contradictions, then it mediates between them and makes a decision. I mean, I'm grossly simplifying here, but hopefully that's a helpful analogy. And this is a collaboration with AI, with Peter Clark's group here. Okay, so here's belief bank. All predictions of the neural models are saved in a memory, the belief bank. So here we have the belief bank, and we save all the predictions of the model in this belief bank. Initially, the belief bank is inconsistent. So you can see here, if you look at the first two assertions, a swallow is a bird, a swallow is a fish, these are contradictory beliefs. And in the initial state, the neural model believes both of them. Then we use a constraint solver that makes the belief bank more consistent. So it's a weighted constraint solver that flips some of the propositions in the belief bank, and it tries to find a set of flips that optimizes consistency. And for that, we need a weighting of each proposition. The weighting comes out of the model here because the model has a certain confidence when it produces a proposition. So we're trying to flip the constraint solver flips the proposition so that that we get a maximally consistent knowledge base, a maximally consistent belief bank. And then we have a feedback loop where we take individual propositions out of the belief bank and feed them back into the input of the neural model. So, for example, now we know that a swallow is not a fish. And for a question like, does a swallow have gills, we can provide this proposition as additional input. So we're kind of reminding, well, the constraint solver did a big part of the work here. So basically helping the neural model by giving it some context that is consistent with its overall beliefs. The overall beliefs after they have been made consistent, I should say. And so if you provide this additional context, a swallow is not a fish, then the model can answer this question, does a swallow have gills, correctly. The original model was not able to answer that correctly. So the original model said, yes, a swallow does have gills, but with this feedback, with this belief bank, corrected belief bank at the feedback loop, the question is now no. And then, so the correct answer to the question is given. Here's an evaluation on a test set that we created for this problem. And so the raw neural model gets an accuracy of question answering test set that has questions like these. Does a swallow have gills? And the original neural model gets an accuracy of 69.3. If we use both the relevance feedback and the constraints, then we get 86.6. So through this neurosymbolic mechanism, we get quite a big improvement. Now, the disappointing part here of this part of the talk is that we tried to apply this to Cota 21, but it didn't work very well, unfortunately. So basically, you need, let me see how I'm doing on time. Oh, I'm already at 45 minutes. Then let me just abbreviate this. Basically, you need, that's always the problem with symbolic components. You need good coverage of the domain that you're trying to do reasoning on. And we didn't have good coverage of clouds and disintegrated rocks and humus. And clouds are actually quite complicated because, you know, you can have clouds underwater, clouded water, you can have clouds in the sky, you can have clouds of dust, and the size of the particles and the weight of the particles of the cloud are important. So clouds are very complicated, and we didn't have good coverage of clouds in our knowledge base, and therefore we weren't able to solve this alignment problem here with Belief Bank. Okay, what's next? I want to compare the three different approaches that I've talked about, the symbolic approach, the neurosymbolic approach, and the neural approach. And I want to ask the question, how well do they for different, I could almost say different types of intelligence that we need for natural language understanding. And I want to make a distinction here between association and knowledge reasoning. And further, I want to make a distinction between context-sensitive knowledge reasoning and context-free knowledge reasoning. So let's start with context-free knowledge reasoning. What I mean by that are facts that are relatively context-independent, like Albert Einstein was born in Ulm, time constraints like transitivity of precedence, similarly for space constraints, math is context-independent. And so the argument that has been frequently made here is we should address these problems with symbolic methods, because symbolic methods really work really well for this stuff. So why would you use a neural model? And I think Dan Roth has a talk that he has given a number of times recently that makes this point very forcefully and very convincingly. So I think if we have context-free knowledge reasoning, we should be using symbolic rules, or a symbolic system at least. And neural approaches don't work very well for context-free knowledge reasoning, at least the ones we have right now. And again, Nora Kassner has done some interesting work on this. In this paper here, together with Philip Dufter, she showed that if you try to query pre-trained language models for facts, for example, what is the capital of France? Then amazingly, they know that it's Paris. But the question is, does it really answer that question, capital of France, what is the capital of France? Or what's the underlying quote unquote reasoning mechanism? And it turns out if you do this just based on vector similarity. So if you just ask, if you compute the vector of France and the vector of cities, large cities, and you ask which large city is most similar to the vector of France, then you get Paris. So if you do this similarity computation, you get very close to the pre-trained language model performance if you use prompts and if you use the full question, what is the capital of France? If you just do the similarity computation, then the word capital actually doesn't occur. So I think it's a nice demonstration of the fact that something may look very interesting and very impressive, but underlyingly, it could just be a primitive similarity computation. And I think in this case, that's what's really the case. PLMs also have a huge problem with negation. And again, Nora gave some very nice evidence here in this paper. And there's also an overview paper, which I would highly recommend for those of you who are interested in these questions, by Rasnevsky, Yates, Kassner, and Weikum, Language Models as or for Knowledge Bases, where they go through a lot of the problems. And the basic, my summary would be that ranking works pretty well. That's something that neural models can do really well. But calibration is a black art. So you don't actually know in my ranked list which answers are correct and which are not, because sometimes there's no correct answer. For example, if you ask who was the first woman on the moon, and sometimes there are lots of correct answers, like give me a list of Turing Award winners. The neural model just gives you a ranked list. And so that's all the information you get, and it's very difficult to do something sensible with that ranked list. Right, and I think that argument that neural models are very limited in this area has been made very well by lots of people before. In the interest of time, I will not go into that. And so I would put a red X here and say neural models are not good at context-free knowledge reasoning. Let me skip the poll since I'm running out of time. On the other hand, neural approaches work very well for association. That's why they are so successful in applications. And for each of these, I think these are probably the big ones: text generation, speech recognition, and neural machine translation. For each of them, you can make the argument that you are basically reducing something that looks like a complex natural language understanding task to a similarity computation. Right. But that's not bad, and that's not insignificant. It just means that association is a good strategy for solving many NLP tasks. Many NLP tasks can be reduced to a similarity computation. So I would say neural models are very good at associational tasks, and I won't go into this, but I think symbolic models cannot handle them. A further distinction that I like, and which I think is very helpful, is the distinction between system 1 and system 2 thinking. This, I mean, you can argue who came up with this analogy first. I'm going to have a slide on that later, but I think it's actually a very nice way, a very insightful way of thinking about this. So association we can think of as system 1 fast thinking, and knowledge reasoning as system 2 slow thinking. That's due to Kahneman. Right, so system 1 is fast, unconscious, automatic, and the role is basically if you have to quickly make a decision, quickly assess a situation. System 2 is slow, deliberate and conscious, effortful, and the role is seeking new or missing information. You realize I cannot make a quick decision because something is missing, which can be complex, and making complex decisions. Now, simple pattern matching, simple association, similarity, I think is a plausible mechanism for system 1 thinking. And system 1 thinking is extremely important. I think Kahneman claims that 98% of human thinking is system 1 fast thinking. And so, as I said, this is not necessarily new. Lots of people have thought about this and talked about these ideas. Yosha Benjo, Yijin Choi, Hang Li, Peter Clark. It's also occurs in the chain of thought prompting literature. I talked first about this in a 2017 invited talk, but I think it's kind of an obvious analogy. So back to Coda 21. I think this task is a good benchmark because it requires system 2 slow thinking. And one piece of evidence for that is that crowdsourcers do not do well on this task. So the big bench people redid all the measurements for our dataset for Quota 21, including the annotation. And they found that the human baseline for Quota 21 was much lower than what we found. So we found close to 90%, and they found, I think, 60% or something like that. So much lower. And the reason is that crowdsourcers are paid by the minute. So they have to go through these tasks as quickly as possible. And of course, then you're trying to use system 1 thinking. And if you're using system 1 thinking, then you're going to keyword match bees and pollen and say, well, that looks like a good match to me. Whereas if you want to really solve the task, you have to think about, does this actually match up? And you have to imagine the situation in which this happens and then realize that it's not the right match. So how do humans do system 2 thinking? And I think we need two things. So this is very speculative, but I think it's an interesting idea. Again, not necessarily original, but I think it's a very important idea that we should be thinking about. So I think we need a dynamic model that defines context. And that dynamic model, I think, needs to be partially symbolic. For example, it needs to be compositional, because if we construct a model, we need some elements that we can combine, and that means compositionality. And we need an operationalization of good fit in this dynamic model. And that's what we need association and neural models for. Because remember that the answer here for our task was not, is something possible or not possible? It was, within the context of this situation, is it a good fit or a bad fit? And that's something that symbolic models can't do. So we need a neural model, an association model that tells us it's a better fit or a worse fit for a particular situation. So I would say for context-sensitive knowledge reasoning, you need new symbolic models. Well, maybe the last thing I'm going to talk about is Lawrence Barsalou, because I think he has some very interesting ideas that we should pay more attention to in deep learning. So there's lots of neurosymbolic model. I briefly flashed the slide just now. But what's missing perhaps is simulation in the context of a dynamic model. And here's an illustration of Barsalou's theory of how that works. So imagine you are in a living room. So this living room contains various objects, a window, a picture, a ball here, and compare two different situations. In one situation, you are looking for an object to change a light bulb, to stand on so that you can change a light bulb. In a different situation, you're looking for an object that you can use to prop open a door. You want to move something through a door, and you need to prop open the door. Now, when you look at the living room, you are in the living room. You're looking around yourself to see what's a good object to do what I want to do. The theory, Barsalou's theory, is that you simulate what would happen if you use that object. So, for example, you're going to simulate what happens if I use the ball and try to prop open the door. That doesn't work very well. Or what happens if I try to use the cat to prop open the door? Doesn't work so well either. And that's how you find, for example, the iron, which would be a good way to prop open the door. And the same for what can I stand on? You cannot stand on an iron or a cat, but you can stand on a chair. You probably don't want to stand on or you can stand on a table. That's also a good way for changing a light bulb. Maybe the safest option here in this context. So the idea is that an important part of, in this case, planning, but more generally of natural language understanding and understanding the world in general, is simulation. You have a complex model and you simulate what happens in that context model. And I think that would be the solution to our Coda 21 problem. We would build a model of this situation and simulate it, and then be able to assess whether one concept is more plausible than the other. Okay. Yeah, since I've talked for an hour, I think, okay, let me just conclude with this slide. So I think Basalu has maybe the clearest and best known exposition of this idea. But there's also simulation semantics, which is very similar, which was active in Berkeley about UC Berkeley 10 years ago. I'm not sure how active it is now. Tenenbaum has published similar ideas, and even Jan de Koen has said for certain types of learning, or I mean, to really make progress on learning, that's how I understand him, you need simulation. And so that means you need to be able to build complex models in which you can do the simulation. So I think that's compatible with what I've said here. And so, of course, Jan de Koen doesn't believe that, but I believe that for simulation to build these complex models, you need both symbolic and neural elements. Okay, I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Hinrich, for this very inspiring talk. And I would hand over to questions. So we are 27 still in the as participants. Maybe you just indicate if you have a question in the chat, and then I will give you the word. And just to start the discussion, maybe I start with one question. So at the very end, you mentioned simulation. I was just trying to think about in this context of that room, how would you do such a simulation without knowing details and characteristics of the involved objects already? I mean, you need to know that an iron, for example, is heavy.
Yeah, I think you would have to know that. I think you can only do the simulation if you have learned before what the properties of an iron are. So it wouldn't work it wouldn't work for a model that has no prior knowledge of properties of the world like that.
And you would collect that from other sources in front.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pre-trained language model paradigm, I think, is a very good paradigm, and so it's amazing what can be learned with this paradigm. So maybe the fact that an iron is heavy can be learned, especially, you know, now we have multimodal pre-trained language models, which are not just based on text. And so probably I think you could learn with such a pre-trained language model that an iron is heavy. Okay. But I mean, as I said, it's somewhat speculative. So I don't have a concrete research proposal of how you would realize this. But I have a feeling that many of the elements are there, and that this is something that could actually happen very soon.
Okay, so maybe I go to the next person who is interested in asking a question. Roman Klinger.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hinrich, for this interesting talk. My question refers back to the first parts of your presentation. In these parts, you assume that prompts are the right way to interact with language models, right? So we use language to interact with language models, and we propose prompts in human language. And I mean, of course, this is totally reasonable. If we interact with humans, we use language, so perhaps it's also a good idea to interact with language models using language, but I'm just wondering if we have evidence that this is really, that the best prompts we could think of are actually human understandable, or perhaps if prompts that don't make sense to humans might actually work better when we use them in language models. Do you have any idea about this? Thank you.
Yes, and I basically agree with what you're suggesting. Probably for any given problem, there is an artificial prompt that that a human wouldn't understand. That's better, but that's not really the point of what we're trying to address. What we're trying to address is how can you solve a few-shot problem, and I think. And the question is, how do you find this optimal prompt? You need training data to be able to find it, and there's quite some research that shows that these artificial prompts can be very powerful. But if you look at them, they all, I think, have a pretty large development set. It's very difficult to train these artificial prompts or to identify them as being effective if you don't have a fair amount of training data or development data. So the setting we are addressing is you have very little training data. In the extreme case, just 10 training examples. And I think in that case, natural language is really the only game in town. And the way I would argue for that is we're not necessarily looking for the best way to express that, but we're looking for the best communication medium between the human and the language model. The language model has been trained on human language. The human speaks language, and therefore I think human language is the best communication medium between them.
Yeah, thank you. That clarifies this for me. Thanks.
Okay, the next question goes to Dominique.
Hi, thank you very much again for the talk. My question is a bit more philosophical. At the beginning, you mentioned that computers don't have true natural language understanding. And my question is whether you have any insights from your research as to what this true human understanding might be. And is it more symbolic or neurosymbolic, or does it go towards one of these directions? Do you have any ideas or opinions?
So, I mean, a very general answer to this question is that, let me show, can you see the belief bank slide?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is kind of the type of, I mean, this has the basic elements of the type of neurosymbolic model that I'm looking for, although it's very, very simplistic. We have a similarity, what I would call a similarity module here. The pre-trained language model, I would say, is just a similarity model. And then we have symbolic elements. We have the constraint solver. It actually also has a non-symbolic component, of course. We have the memory bank, which is really purely, well, it also has weights, so it's also neurosymbolic. And then we have the feedback mechanism. And so one analogy that may be helpful is that if you look at the brain, you know, you have different centers in the brain. For example, you have, you know, part for object recognition, and then another part for representing the parts of the body. And then you have something for tools and for faces, and then you have other parts of the, for example, the frontal lobe that that communicates with all of these and takes input from these, and you could think of many of these as actually being similarity modules. For example, faces. Maybe there's some evidence that that similarity plays a large role if you recognize faces. But the frontal lobe, when it the executive function, often integrates all of these judgments. And so I think the very general point I was trying to make is that we need something like that. We need something, a layer above on top of the neural similarity models that does something with them. Yeah, I'm not sure whether that addresses your question at least partially.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And
Okay.
unfortunately, we have a very limited understanding of how the brain works. I mean, I try to keep up a little bit on the neuroscience and cognitive science literature, but you know, our understanding is extremely limited. So I'm hoping that in the next years there will be a breakthrough and we will have a better understanding of how intelligence is realized by the brain. And I think that could really be the basis for a breakthrough in artificial intelligence.
Okay, the next question goes to Benjamin Roth.
Hi. First of all, thanks for the wonderful and inspiring talk. So I would have a question for the first part of the talk, where language is the interface to guiding a model via prompts or patterns. And so I'm wondering, like if you look at machine learning in general, we can make some assumptions that allow us to develop a theory. For example, like the samples are drawn IID for the training set and for the test set, and then we can have some sanity checks with math. Let's say we can derive some theoretical models. So if we learn from prompts or from examples or task descriptions, so we are not in that setting anymore. So if you want to build a mathematical theory for that, so what kind of assumptions do you think would go into that? So what should we assume, the properties, kind of, for example, so all the prompts that we give have 100% precision, but they might not, like the recall might be very low or something like this, or do they have some properties that they very prototypical in some mathematical sense, or they just drawn from some set of samples, but it's just a very small set, or is there a hierarchy? Let's say we first start with one instruction which covers like a lot, and then kind of we contradicted like in partially with some more examples, or like what do you think like should be formalizable assumptions? Like, do you have any ideas there?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that's certainly a weakness of this work, that that we don't really have a theory of I mean, we don't have error bounds, or I mean, in the most recent paper we do look at the error bounds empirically, but I mean, we have no formal results on when this works, when this doesn't work, and so on. I mean, there are some principles, like you want to make your prompts as diverse as possible. So, but probably thinking of how you could organize them in a more structured way, for example, through a hierarchy, as you suggest, that is, I think, an interesting and promising idea that one should pursue. Right. I mean, I should mention one thing. So, of course, it's very what's the word? Worrying that you're doing something and you're basically in the dark. And so that's one potential criticism of this approach. So you're designing your prompts, you're designing your verbalizers, you run your experiments, and you're basically completely in the dark about what's happening because you don't have a depth set, you don't have an evaluation set. That's not entirely true, because you can actually look at the zero-shot performance of the prompts. And that's what Timo always does in developing his systems. And the zero-shot performance on a particular prompt gives you some indication of whether it's a good prompt or a bad prompt. So if the zero-shot performance is really bad, then maybe you don't want to use that prompt. If the zero-shot performance is really good, then it indicates that it might be a good prompt. But I mean, part of the problem, I think, is that so Timo's motivation for this was that this is a real situation. He was working as a consultant. I mean, the first couple of years he did his dissertation research with me, he was actually working as a consultant. And these few-shot problems were the typical problems he had to deal with as a consultant. You have a very small training set. Either people don't want to invest the money to create large training sets, or it has to go really fast, so you can't organize the annotation. Maybe you want to do an initial pilot to see, does this make sense at all? And then you don't want to invest a lot of time and money in that pilot. So this is a real problem, and we should address this real problem. I mean, that's more of an engineering argument, I guess. And so he was really interested in solving this problem. And I think what he presented is a very nice solution to it. But I do agree with you that there is a lack of theory here, and that is certainly what's the word? Yeah, a drawback of this.
Thank you.
Okay, further questions? There's no question indicated in the chat, so it's a quick chance to ask a question. But apparently everybody is satisfied. So thanks again, Hinrich, for this very nice talk. It was a pleasure to have you here online. And hopefully we will see each other in the future in presence as well.
Yeah, I hope so too. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for these nice questions and for having me.
All right.
Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.